All right. Hello, everyone. We are about 2 minutes out or so. So 2 minutes and we will get up and rolling. Make sure that I have all of my stuff taken care of and then we will be up and going. All right, everyone. So we'll give it another minute or so for folks to file in. So we are also live on our Facebook page. So if you aren't here, we're also there. So we'll give it another minute or so as people file in, and then we will start talking about when the Spanish influenza came to Bangor back in 1918. All right, so we are up on 4:30. So we will just go ahead and get started and other folks can join in as they come along. So my name is Patrick Callaway. I'm the collections coordinator here at the MDI Historical Society. One of my other hats is that I'm a lecturer in the history department at the University of Maine. And I was teaching about this time last year when we started to hear the words COVID-19 or coronavirus for the first time. And realistically, for a while, I personally didn't think much of it. But then at a very particular moment, as I was standing in front of a class back in March of 2020, when I had started the class, school was open, everything was okay. By the end of that class, the university was closing, and the life as we knew it, at least then, had changed at the drop of a hat. So, this is going to be really a research project that I'm undertaking, in part to try to understand the history, but in a very real way, trying to understand the history that we are all living through. Because there are a number of very close parallels between what we saw in 1918 in the Spanish influenza outbreak and what we're seeing today with the COVID 19 or coronavirus outbreak. So, a number of similarities that I'm going to trace, at least in this work in progress, through the pages of the Bangor Daily News. So, taking a look at some of the highlights that we see there and the headlines we see there, and to see where and if we can draw some parallels between what we saw in the past and what we are seeing in the present. So, as we start this, I do owe a special thank you to the Bangor Public Library and their archivist there. Many of the BDN records are available digitally, and they were very, very helpful to me in trying to track them down. So be nice to the archivists and librarians in your life. They can make your life very easy. So let's take a look at some of the things going on in Bangor. So first, of course, we need some context. So our chat, Spanish flu, comes to Bangor. And the first thing that we need to talk about is some of the context. So 1918, we are right in the middle of World War I, coming towards the end of it. And what we are seeing is that there are a number of effects of the war just based on the conflict itself. So Spanish influenza is so called because the Spanish were neutral in the war itself, and they were the only press that was openly publishing about an outbreak of disease that was spreading across Europe and across the world. Officially, news of this was suppressed. In our own archives, we have a collection of letters from Raymond Soames, who was in the service in France at the time, and he mentions virtually nothing about illness of any type, much less influenza. As we come through 1917, disease in the trenches was common. So things like cold, flu, crowd diseases, typhus, things of that nature were just part of the misery of war. Mixed up in this at some point from somewhere, we have another strand of influenza that later becomes known as the Spanish flu. One theory is that it came from a military camp in Kansas. Another theory is that it came through the Etable military hospital in France. We're not sure. That has yet to be proven by any historians or virologists anywhere. But that is the two working theories. Certainly, the disease and its spread is assisted by the war. As people gather from all over the country and all over the world, whether at military camps in the States or in the military effort in France or throughout the world, people congregate together from all over. And as we've heard at length for the last year, the virus doesn't move, the people do. And this is very much the case with World War I. So the image here is of a dog in the trenches. This was seen as a health measure because laid out in front of him were the rats and the mice that he would catch. So just part of that disease habitat that we're looking at in World War I, this was one of the official solutions put forward by the British military, was to get a dog and teach it to chase the rats. So an exceptionally brutal time in and of itself, but from the perspective of disease, a perfect disease breeding habitat, as you have thousands and tens of thousands of people living in close quarters with poor food, poor sanitation. As we see with our dog here, lots of mice and vermin. This is a condition that is ripe for the spread of disease. So what does that have to do with Bangor, Maine? And this was really one of the challenges that I was trying to work through as I was putting this together or as I was standing in front of my class a year ago. What does these big events somewhere over there have to do with my daily life or with my community? Well, in the Spanish flu, this flu finds Bangor and the rest of Maine relatively quickly. So this is the headline from the BDN on the 1st of October, 1918. And it is advertising a series of preventative measures before things get too bad. By this time, throughout Europe, in some of the military posts like at Camp Devers in Massachusetts or Fort Riley in Kansas, Spanish influenza was absolutely epidemic. The number of cases had crashed the hospital system. There was a shortage of nurses, of beds, of hospital space. And public officials in Maine did not want to see that happen here. On October the first set of notices go out that there will be some changes in the way people live their lives. And that is going to include things like closing down churches, theaters, clubs, places of entertainment, or any places where people might congregate together in close quarters. So if this sounds very familiar to us in 2021, this is essentially the same thing that we saw show up in our own lives about this time last year. It was relatively controversial back in that day, as it is in ours in some quarters. But this is going to be the start of the crisis, so to speak, in Bangor. So the 1st of October, as a preventative measure, there will be changes. So skipping forward just a little bit less than a week, I love block quotes out of newspapers. In the present day, when a newspaper or another public official is trying to get public attention, they tend to use fewer words. Depending on your news source, it might get a little bit explicit. But back in 1918, if you wanted to get public notice, you did not use fewer words, you used more words. So this is the complaint in the newspaper about people not adhering to the regulations put forward by the Board of Public Health. So if this sounds vaguely familiar as well, it's very similar. And what this is a call for social distancing, as we would call it today. Back then, public notices of this nature tended to go through the newspapers, and the language that we saw through the newspapers for that first week of October was pretty explicit, that places of public assembly, churches, schools, and so forth, were closed as a public health measure. And yet here we are a week later with people needing to have what they call, quote, personal instruction and emphatic assurance that the order means exactly what it said. That is very strong language for that day and age. The idea being that there were some people who were either in the dark, as the news article suggests, or who were so careless about themselves or their community that they had failed to adhere to the public health regulations. There are reflections to the present, as we notice very widely in some quarters these days. But in Bangor, 1918, this is the type of language that you would find when the public officials and the health officials wanted to make a very clear and direct point about what was expected of everybody. So moving forward, what else is going on in the BDN on the 5th of October? We see the headline to our left, Battle with the Grip. The words Spanish influenza or Spanish flu really do not appear in the newspapers, at least in the United States. Consistently throughout the health crisis, in the BDN, it's called the grip. So we're week in, we have that lengthy notice about social distancing and the closure of public places of assembly. At the moment, it's not that bad. Now, less than 200 cases in Bangor. The newspaper urges you to shun sneezers, which is a pretty good bit of advice anyway. But a week into the crisis, the disease is now subject to quarantine. So this is the first time that we see this, where if somebody was afflicted with Spanish influenza, there was an obligation to report that disease from their physician to the state, and that they were obligated to quarantine themselves until cleared by public health. In the middle section, we also see a quick line right at the end that says, they will quarantine at the home where the disease is present. So think of this again as another social distancing measure. It is just not the afflicted, it is also everybody associated with that household. In newspapers, juxtaposition can be pretty interesting. Now, where things are situated on the page in relation to one another can be fun. So, right next to the subject to quarantine and the 5th of October, we see the story of a wedding. So, bride and groom are wed, but everybody is wearing a mask. The news article ends with the somewhat tragic line that the bride knelt beside the cot where her beloved was afflicted, and the bridal pair did not kiss. A little bit of an interesting detail to see in a 1918 newspaper, but that gives you an idea of the seriousness that people are starting to approach this question with. So, moving ahead a little bit, 8th of October, so we're a little over a week in, and we're starting to see another familiar element. So, a more formal type of contact tracing, particularly to the military installation at Camp Devers in Massachusetts. Remember, this is World War I, and soldiers are being drafted and called up and trained at military posts across the nation. And many of the Maine recruits, either draftees or volunteers, were being trained at Camp Devers. And what the state was able to do was trace many of the cases that were present in Maine to somebody that had visited that camp or who was associated with somebody that did. So we see early contact tracing had put forward in the Bangor newspaper, in part to try to explain where this had come from, but also in part, I think, as a warning to others that might have had contact with people who had been at that camp to be cautious about their health. We also start to see an influx of advice. What to do if you are affected with Spanish influenza. And there's a number of different remedies that people put forward. One from Quebec suggests that there is a disinfectant using argorial or colloidal silver protein that is guaranteed to kill influenza. Now, whether that is or is not the case, I'm not sure. However, it is very ironic that it comes from a seminary in Quebec when the usual use for that medication was as a treatment for venereal disease in 1918. So, whether it was effective or not, I'm not sure, but there is a real irony there. More officially, the health commissioner comes out with his suggestions. So, don't resort to rum. Alcohol at this time is a very hot button issue in American society, as we're starting to see the growth of prohibition as an official policy. Don't take up smoking. Don't look for immunity in the camphor bag. Camphor was an inhalant, so it's one of the ingredients in Vicks Vapor Rub. And in other parts of the newspaper, we see that there are mass shortages of Vicks Vapor Rub because that was thought to also be a cure for Spanish influenza. Don't expect sulfur in your shoes to ward off the plague. I'm not entirely sure what sulfur in your shoes would do, but that's the suggestion. And it also says don't use gargles or sprays, which would be a direct contradiction of something else on the same page of the newspaper about that Quebec remedy for influenza. So, interesting parallel to some of the things that we've seen in the present day about potential cures or treatments for COVID-19 and the conflicting advice that comes along with it. So what else is going on? Move forward a little bit. The 12th of October, an astonishing jump in cases. By now, people are starting to become very concerned and panicked. What are we to do? And the suggestion from the newspaper was to do nothing new. Go to bed and stay quiet, take a laxative, eat plenty of food. Nature is the cure. But the panic is unwarranted because influenza has a low percentage of fatalities. Bear in mind, this is a newspaper on the 12th of October, and the full scope of what is going to be a 2-year pandemic disease is not clear. So, overall, we are talking about tens of millions dead over the course of a couple of years. On one hand, this is perhaps a public notice. No, don't panic. On the other hand, how much did they really know in order to provide that assurance? So, also happening, and juxtaposition in the newspaper again, the crew at the Bangor shipyard will be increased. So remember, this is World War One, so things like shutting down the entire economy or shutting down things like the shipyards, which had a military purpose, well, that simply is just not part of the picture. So move forward, and we're now 2 weeks in, and a couple of interesting things. The idea of wearing face masks was also another part of the conversation that we have back in 1918 and how to make those. Now, I personally get mine off Etsy, but that's not an option in 1918. So we see in the newspaper, as part of a lengthy commentary on how the public can protect themselves and one another from the Spanish influenza, are these directions for how to make a face mask out of gauze. Unspoken in this is a very significant gender, uh, it's a gender assumption. Because right next to the directions for how to make a gauze mask is an article about a change in the sugar rationing. So, shopping traditionally was done by the women. So, the juxtaposition of these two things is very telling. At the bottom of the sugar rationing article, we see a warning, presumably for young gentlemen, about, quote, don't marry a girl who looks like a magazine cover and expect her to work like a cookbook. Not entirely sure why that needed to be included on something about sugar rationing. I think the suggestion might be that there is a connection there about a potential girl ability in the kitchen to use up and make do, along with sugar rationing, some sort of connection there. But it is an interesting commentary on the social expectations of 1918. So, more headlines. The call to nursing, and this becomes a regular feature in numerous newspapers at this time, not just in Bangor. How do you care for hundreds of sick people? They're out of hospital space. You see in our headline to the left that the girls' high school house is a hospital annex converted over. The Red Cross is trying to organize relief, but there's hope that the pneumonia serum is here. Now, this is interesting in one respect because they don't know about viruses yet. Virus had not yet been discovered scientifically. So the pneumonia serum is probably going to do nothing at all for influenza. As we get forward, the bottom one is from the 19th of October. The grip, so influenza, is on the wane, and the relief begins. And for that, they need resources. So donations and supplies, which again is perhaps another parallel that we see to our present day. Move forward another week, and we start to see some signs of normality. So the grip gloom is soon to be dispelled. Likely in the next week that we will happen to see the end of the church and theater closings. That's good. The ultimate sign of civilization, the new football schedule. The revised schedule, because of the epidemic, new games had to be arranged. So here's the new football schedule. It is a little bit of an irony that the football games open up before the schools are open or the theaters or other establishments are open. Certain irony there. But this is a sign that the public is starting to come out of this. To our right, though, we see that things are not so good everywhere. So, influenza had a dramatic effect in other places. This is a news article put into the BDN from New York about how the telephone systems were ceasing to function because the operators were being afflicted with influenza at such a high rate. So, a very interesting set of contrasts that we see here within the same day in the same newspaper. By the end of October, public patience had really come to an end with the public health measures. So they were a month in. There's a question of how much grip is here, how long is the town going to be closed? The health officials can't or won't answer either of these questions. It's only vague guesswork. The school children are far behind in their studies. The business is generally upset, getting on the public's nerves. They're not clear exactly what is getting on the public's nerves, whether it's the businesses being closed and upset, whether it's the schools being closed, or whether it's all of the above. But that is going to be a real important element that we see over the next couple of weeks in the newspaper, where public utility and public patience with these health measures of having their normal accustomed lives being impacted by quarantine regulations and so forth is really at an end. So finally, we get to the end. So 5 weeks later, the first week of November, the grip gloom lifts. The Board of Health raises the siege declared 5 weeks ago, the siege being the public health emergency. A very interesting wartime connection there for November of 1918. And business is starting to open as usual. Schools will start the next day, the theaters will open, and the cases of the grip have gone down. 5 weeks later, Bangor had survived, scathed and battered, but successfully. So, what does this all mean for us sitting here in 2021? As I was reading through this, all of these different headlines and all of the different pages of the newspapers and public documents, it really struck me on how similar a lot of these things sound, and a lot of the feelings and emotions that you can see behind the headlines and in the text. So, things like fear, things like trying to find out where this illness is coming from. What measures should people take to protect themselves and their community? Maybe some good suggestions, maybe some not good suggestions that are coming along. So, this is going to be some of the things that we have become familiar with in 2021. If we think back over the last year, the word of the hour is probably unprecedented. We've heard that in a number of different contexts. We've heard that in a number of different places, that the events that we're going through, the emotions that we're feeling are unprecedented, never been seen before. But as we look back to our history, we see that really these are not unprecedented times. That if we look back a little over 100 years, that we see some of the very similar ideas, some of the very similar concerns that we have seen in 2020 and 2021 were there for probably our grandparents or perhaps even our great grandparents by now, back in 1918. Certainly still a dramatic set of circumstances and a traumatic set of experiences, but not really unprecedented. because as we look back at our newspapers, we have seen this before, at least in some degree. So that brings us to the end of this particular Chebacco chat. So thank you to everybody who made it out for this. The recordings, I believe, will be up on our Facebook page for the Society, either Friday or perhaps on Monday. And I wish all of you a very happy, uh, weekend. I'm looking forward to it. And have a great rest of the evening. Thank you.